Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos. Listen for a moment to the quiet of a desert night. Wind moves through cactus spines. A far-off train hums, and an old man turns a page in a book he wrote about himself. He once walked streets where whispers were currency, where a nod could open doors and a wrong glance could close them forever. His name crossed oceans twice, carried by sailors, merchants, and police files. He grew up near a blue Sicilian bay, came of age in New York when hidden rooms poured liquor into teacups, and lived long enough to watch his world shrink to a sunlit porch in Arizona. People later called him Joe Bananas, a nickname he never liked, a tag that sounded like a joke pinned to a careful, precise life. He stood for an older code, talked little, trusted less, and organized his days as neatly as a bank ledger. Tonight we walked beside him from the start, not to celebrate wrongdoing, but to understand how one person, using loyalty, fear, and timing, built and held power. This is a true account drawn from public records, testimony, journalism, and his own words, told without graphic detail, mindful of the real harm hidden behind polite euphemisms. Joseph Charles Bonanno was born in 1905 in Castellammare del Golfo, a coastal town in western Sicily. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, olive trees broke the wind on the hills. The town's families had old ties, and the young boy grew up hearing about honor, obligation, and silence. He learned early to listen before speaking. War and upheaval came to Italy while he was still young, and politics brought new pressure. In the 1920s, the regime in Rome cracked down on networks long rooted in Sicilian life. Men were arrested, houses searched, and meetings watched. A cautious teenager with ambition looked west, toward a country where friends and relatives were already sending letters back about work and money. He reached New York in the mid-1920s, after a short stop in Cuba, a journey many from his town took. Brooklyn felt crowded and alive. The smell of bread, coffee, and machine oil filled the air. Former neighbors from the old port city ran bakeries, carpentry shops, import businesses, and underneath the storefronts, other trades tied to the new economy that had sprung up once the United States banned alcohol. Prohibition created demand. Bottles that had been legal yesterday became contraband today. And the market did what markets do. It found supply chains. Those chains needed organizers, bookkeepers, and fixers who could place a quiet word with a dock boss, or keep track of cash without writing down names. Joseph was young, quick, and discreet. He worked, watched, and remembered who owed what to whom. In Brooklyn and Manhattan, two older camps contended for control. On one side stood men aligned with Joe Masseria, who had come to power through force and older ties. On the other side gathered the Castellammare circle, led by Salvatore Maranzano, whose base included many from Joseph's hometown. The conflict between these camps in 1930-1931 came to be known in newspapers as a war, though it moved as much through meetings, betrayals, and pressure on businesses as through open street fights. In this climate, Joseph found mentors who valued his steadiness. He handled errands at first, then accounts. He learned how to move crates without drawing suspicion, how to speak to a warehouse foreman so the foreman felt like a partner rather than a target, how to shift profits from a speakeasy to a safer place before police could seize cash. What did those early years include, in concrete terms? According to law enforcement files and later testimony, he took part in activities that were common in that underground economy: the distribution of liquor despite the ban, the collection of payments for protection tied to delivery routes and storefronts, the management of illegal gambling in back rooms, and loans to shopkeepers at steep rates with the threat of pressure if payments fell behind. He did not wave guns or shout in public. He preferred to build a network where people paid because it felt safer than refusing. When tensions rose, he acted as a go-between, smoothing conversations, reducing flare-ups that could attract attention. That ability to keep tempers down in a heated city made him valuable. The conflict between the Masseria side and the Maranzano circle ended in 1931 after a series of decisive moments. Both top leaders were eliminated by rivals. Newspapers described these events in bold headlines, while the city tried to return to daily routine. Younger men, including figures like Charles Luciano, argued for a new structure that would reduce costly feuds and stabilize profits. They reshaped the landscape into what came to be called the Five Families in New York, with a national forum known as the Commission to Mediate Disputes. Joseph, only 26 that year, was placed at the head of the group once led by Maranzano. It was an extraordinary promotion, a careful, self-controlled young man now responsible for many crews, with interests touching docks, garment shops, restaurants, and neighborhood banks. He took the job with a planner's mindset. He kept his name out of the papers, avoided obvious displays, and pushed for quiet growth. His family's revenue sources mirrored the wider underworld of the time: illegal gambling, loan collections, protection payments, and influence in labor unions that could slow or speed the movement of goods. He also encouraged investments in legitimate businesses, bakeries, cheese importers, garment factories, and later real estate, so cash could be washed through lawful operations. This mix of the legal and illegal would become a hallmark of his approach. To minimize conflict, he preferred partnerships over raw force, but the threat of force stood behind those deals. When he met with a factory owner, he could speak calmly about trucking delays and insurance, and the owner understood what that meant without anyone needing to be blunt. In the early 1930s, as the alcohol ban ended and new markets replaced the old, Joseph adjusted. With liquor once again above board, other trades took center stage. Card games moved to social clubs, numbers games flowed through barbershops and candy stores. Union influence over delivery schedules became leverage at the loading docks. Law enforcement would later accuse figures tied to his organization of participating in narcotics smuggling, especially as international sources and city distribution patterns evolved after the war. Joseph publicly denied involvement in that line, and he wrote later that he forbade it. Police files and court statements, however, link members of his group to that trade at various points. His own role, as described by investigators, was managerial and insulated, with buffers designed to keep his hands away from day-to-day risk. He built a reputation for reliability among peers from other cities. Out-of-town bosses viewed him as cautious and principled in his way. He insisted on punctual payments, orderly books, and respect for boundaries. He was not a gambler by nature. He did not chase fast scores. This temperament helped him avoid the kind of flamboyant mistakes that brought police onto some rivals. He also had a knack for choosing lieutenants who could handle specific neighborhoods, men who could sit in a club and read, who in the room had influence, who needed a favor, and who would fold under pressure. The circle around him learned that calm reduced the number of raids, that subtlety kept headlines away, and that a steady hand at the top allowed everyone beneath him to sleep a little easier. At the same time, the legitimate side of his life grew. He married, raised children, and invested in respectable firms. These businesses gave him reasons to travel and meet city officials, union leaders, and bankers. He dressed simply, spoke softly, and could pass as a successful importer or manufacturer. That was by design. Police might suspect, but suspicion without hard evidence makes for weak cases. When officers tailed him, they often saw a man visiting relatives, dining quietly, or touring a warehouse he partly owned through a chain of holding companies. To outsiders, he looked like a cautious businessman, among many in a city bustling with post-prohibition energy. Behind that calm, he maintained discipline. He expected loyalty. Reports from informants, and later memoirs, describe how disagreements inside his group were handled mostly through meetings, fines, or reassignment, with harsher measures reserved for breaches that threatened the whole structure. He believed in order, and order required consequences, yet he also knew that dramatics brought scrutiny. So he pushed disputes toward quiet settlements when possible, used senior advisors to cool hot heads, and preferred to keep internal problems in-house. When outside threats emerged, new crews encroaching on routes, activists challenging union deals, he deployed influence and persuasion first, reserving rough tactics for last. He also developed ties beyond New York. People from his hometown had settled in Montreal and other Canadian cities, and business flowed back and forth across that border. Those links would become important in later decades, as certain trades shifted internationally. He valued family connections, both literal and cultural. A shared origin meant a shared vocabulary, shared customs, and often a shared outlook on risk and reward. In meetings, he could switch languages, slip into an idiom from the Old Bay, and build trust faster. That cultural capital mattered in a world where written contracts were rare, and a handshake backed by reputation was everything. In public life, the 1930s also brought attention from journalists and elected officials who were learning to say organized crime as a phrase. Some lawmakers held hearings, asking police and prosecutors to describe the scale of illegal gambling or union corruption. Joseph's name rarely appeared outright then, a testament to his low profile, but detectives knew the structure existed and kept files on key figures. Those files sketched a network of companies, clubhouses, and intermediaries. Names connected to his circle showed up on licenses for jukebox distributors, beer trucks, and garment shops. Regulators might deny a license here or there, but the network adapted, putting a cousin or a friend of a friend on the paperwork. This cat-and-mouse routine would continue for decades. He visited Arizona as early as the late 1930s and 1940s, drawn by the climate and the chance to place money in land and buildings far from New York's attention. Tucson felt like another planet compared to Brooklyn. Wide skies, mountain shadows, streets that ended at open desert. He liked it. He could walk without being recognized, talk business over coffee in a quiet diner, and send letters back east without the nightly tension of the city. Health reasons were cited for spending time there, and warmth did help. Over time, Arizona became a second base, a place to think and plan. It also gave him plausible distance from day-to-day city operations, which he now supervised through trusted intermediaries. That separation made it harder for prosecutors to tie him directly to local crimes, because he increasingly looked like an investor and advisor rather than a street operator. By the middle of the 1930s, his standing among the New York families was set. He sat on the National Council that resolved disputes, voted on punishments for breaches, and enforced boundaries between groups. His style contrasted with a few contemporaries who enjoyed the spotlight. He avoided grand clubs with public facades, and kept his meetings small. When national matters arose, how to divide territory in a growing suburb, how to handle a labor leader who stopped returning calls, he argued for compromise backed by the threat of collective pressure. If someone persisted in causing expensive trouble, the council could authorize stronger action. In those rooms he tended to speak last, letting others lay out positions before summarizing, and guiding the group toward a decision that preserved balance. None of this erased the reality that crimes were committed by the enterprise he led. People were shaken down, competition was blunted, and communities bore costs. The story here does not hide that. It does, however, avoid glamour, and avoids the kind of detail that teaches methods. Think of his life as the administrative face of an illegal corporation. He set strategy, assigned roles, and drew profit from gambling, loans, extortion, and influence over unions and businesses, while keeping a buffer between himself and direct enforcement. Law enforcement, informants, and later historians pieced that picture together from surveillance, arrests of lower-level participants, and the occasional insider who chose to cooperate. Joseph disputed some of those portrayals, especially around specific trades like narcotics. The record shows a pattern: denial from the top, activity among subordinates, and a structure designed to protect leadership. As the 1930s turned to the 1940s, war overseas and change at home pulled attention away from the underworld for a time. Rationing reshaped supply chains, factories changed outputs, ports faced priorities unrelated to contraband. In that period, Joseph's network focused on the steady earners, gambling, loans, and union leverage. He encouraged the development of more legitimate fronts, knowing that post-war America would bring new scrutiny. He bought or backed restaurants, garment cutters, produce importers. He urged younger men to learn bookkeeping, to read balance sheets, to present themselves as entrepreneurs. The old world of loud bravado was, in his mind, bad business. He was still not yet 35 when he had already become something rare in that city, a long-term planner in a field that tended to devour its own. His choices in those early years favoring order over spectacle, blending legal and illegal streams, extending his reach quietly to distant places like Arizona and Canada, set the pattern for the rest of his life. The risks he took were real, the profits substantial, the harm to others real as well, even if it arrived wrapped in polite conversations about insurance or arrangements. The next years would test his patience and caution. New rivals would rise with different ideas. Government attention would sharpen, and the steady hand that kept his world calm would be forced to hold firm through storms he could not entirely control. He entered the 1940s with the manner of a careful shopkeeper, even while running an illegal empire. The city had changed again. Factories whirred for war, harbor cranes never rested, and ration books shaped grocery lines. In that churn he held fast to steady earners. Card rooms moved softly behind bakery counters. Number slips passed with the morning paper. Trucking schedules and union votes set the rhythm of entire neighborhoods. He liked that rhythm because it could be measured, predicted, and priced. He sat with foremen, stewards, and small owners and talked about order and peace, words that in that world meant paid agreements, reliable pickups, and no surprise strikes. People understood that paying once was cheaper than fighting forever. He put accountants next to enforcers, gave polite men the first shot at solving problems, and kept street heat low. The less noise, the longer the money moved, and the safer he stayed from a courtroom. War priorities pulled police toward ports and sabotage fears, which opened space for a quieter figure to deepen roots. He looked after gambling parlors, loan collections, and union influence that could slow a conveyor belt or open the gate at dawn. Investigators later tied some of his wider circle to wartime black markets, where sugar, meat, and fuel drew high prices. He avoided public bids and bright lights, favoring side doors and handshake pacts. He told younger associates to learn ledgers and to treat every meeting like a job interview. He believed that old-world manners disarmed suspicion. A hat lifted at the right moment often did more than a threat. He did not brag. He let payments, appointments, and schedules do the talking, and his nickname in print stayed a joke he ignored while he built a system focused on predictability. Beyond New York, his ties reached Buffalo and the Canadian side, where relatives and fellow townsmen from Castellamare del Golfo managed cafes, shipping firms, and private clubs. He respected Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo, a senior figure and kin by heritage, and tried to keep harmony with him even as both valued autonomy. Montreal, especially, began to matter. Trade routes, immigrant neighborhoods, and a bilingual city hall created conditions useful to smugglers and gamblers. Law enforcement and later court testimony connected members of his organization to ventures there, and reporters would write that one of his most forceful lieutenants, Carmine Galante, traveled north to advance those interests. Joseph publicly denied running narcotics and said he forbade it. Files and indictments, however, tied people under his banner to that trade. His style, layers of buffers, many intermediaries, and distant oversight from Arizona made it hard to pin direct involvement on him. Inside his group, he preferred elders at the table. For years, his underboss was Frank Garofalo, a calm administrator who could settle tempers without bumping chairs. After Garofalo stepped back in the mid-1950s, Galante's influence rose. Galante had a different energy, brash, ambitious, and feared, but even he fit within Joseph's larger idea. Markets must be managed, not spun into chaos. Gaspar Di Gregorio, a seasoned captain from the same Sicilian route, handled crews that valued tradition. This mix gave Joseph options. When a shopkeeper balked, the polite emissary went first. If that failed, a harder voice followed. When two crews disputed a slice of the garment district, he called everyone in and set a line on a map. The concept was simple. If everyone knew the rule, fewer men ended up in cells, fewer headlines burned the business, and the profits smoothed out month by month. He expanded his legitimate face with patience. He became a citizen in 1945, dressed like a broker, and built a portfolio that included cheese importers, garment cutters, a funeral service tie, and real estate in Brooklyn, Queens, and increasingly, Tucson. Arizona drew him for health and privacy. He bought land, a comfortable house, and stakes in respectable firms. The desert gave him distance from day-to-day disputes without breaking control. Phones, couriers, and scheduled trips kept information flowing. FBI agents began to take a sharper interest as the post-war years progressed. They watched his lunches, recorded license plates, and built diagrams connecting him to social clubs and delivery companies. He made their work tedious. Meetings happened on walks. Notes rarely existed. He taught his circle to treat every room as if a wall could listen. That discipline made his file thick but thin on chargeable detail. National attention landed on organized crime with the Kefauver hearings in 1950-1951. Televised sessions showed senators grilling bookmakers, sheriffs, and nightclub owners about payoffs and interstate rackets. Some New York figures were named openly, others found their faces on front pages. Joseph stayed mostly off camera, a result of careful habits and the use of fronts. Reporters began to use the flippant Joe Bananas label, which he resented as both silly and disrespectful of the old code. He refused interviews, avoided grand entrances, and reminded his men that fame was expensive. Still, a pattern emerged in public records. When a jukebox company won a contract in a district where his crews were strong, a detective's memo often mentioned a cousin on the board. When a union vote flipped, an informant note suggested a meeting the night before at a cafe linked to his people. It was a web with many strands and few loose ends. The mid-1950s brought a marriage that seemed like strategy wrapped as romance. His son Bill, educated, polished, and eager to be helpful, fell for Rosalie Profaci, niece of Joe Profaci, the Brooklyn boss known for tight controls and steady income from food, vending, and union arrangements. Their 1956 wedding joined two clans that already cooperated. To outsiders, it looked like a pure love story. Inside the life, people also read it as an alliance. Joseph liked alliances. They offered stability, reduced costly feuds, and signaled a united front on the commission. the National Council where bosses met to set policy and settle disputes. But alliance by marriage could create jealousy and fear in rival seats. Every bond produces a shadow, and in this case that shadow would matter in the next decade when old men fell ill and newer men saw opportunity in their absence. And then came a meeting that exposed the underground to broad daylight. In November 1957, dozens of bosses and lieutenants drove to the house of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, a small town in upstate New York, for what many described afterward as a national conference. Local police noticed a parade of expensive cars, grew curious, and set up roadblocks. The scene that followed, men in suits running across lawns and into woods, splashed across newspapers from coast to coast. Many attendees were stopped, questioned, or arrested on minor charges. Joseph later said he did not attend. Some investigators believed he avoided the dragnet by staying away. Others speculated he arrived but left before the net closed. What mattered was the effect. Public, elected, and police attention sharpened overnight. From that day, anyone at his level understood that secrecy had limits and that habits had to tighten further. Appalachian set off raids, grand jury subpoenas, and fresh task forces. New York's governor demanded action. Federal agencies pooled information, and state troopers grew bolder about staking out social clubs. Joseph retreated further into his business-like shell. He split time between Brooklyn and Tucson, let trusted captains run routine meetings, and took long walks instead of long dinners. He was subpoenaed more than once, and invoked his right to avoid self-incrimination when asked pointed questions. He preferred fines for contempt to risky answers. He had lawyers on retainer, accountants who understood two sets of books, and an instinct for time, when to sit still, when to travel, when to let a matter cool before returning to it. Younger associates learned that surviving scrutiny required patience and plain clothes, not swagger. By 1959, the crime map shifted again. Vito Genovese, who had pushed to the front earlier in the decade, was convicted on narcotics charges. Carlo Gambino, quiet and strategic, grew in influence. Tommy Lucchese remained smooth and connected. Joe Profaci's health faltered. In that mix, Joseph looked for balance. He leaned on old ties to Profaci's camp, found common language with Magaddino, and kept a wary eye on Gambino's growing reach. He favored coalitions, the slow arithmetic of votes on the commission, and the promise that boring decisions outlast dramatic stunts. To strengthen standing, he promoted Galante as underboss, putting force on one side of the scale and diplomacy on the other. He also placed Bill closer to operations, a move that pleased a father but stirred resentment among older captains who believed seniority should govern advancement. Tension in the Profaci organization spilled into the streets in the early 1960s, when soldiers under the Gallo brothers rebelled against what they called unfair shares. That dispute cut into business across borough lines. Joseph tried to calm it from a distance, because disorder in one family rippled through the others, inviting police raids and lost revenue. When Joe Profaci died in 1962, Joseph Magliocco inherited leadership of that group. Newspapers quoted anonymous sources, saying Joseph backed Magliocco, kinship through marriage, and a taste for the old ways made them natural allies. Across the river, Gambino and Lucchese had their own vision for the future. The commission became a chessboard with pieces that had memories, grudges, and overlapping interests. In that climate, whispers gathered force, and one whisper would soon become a very loud problem. According to later statements and widely reported accounts, Magliocco confided in Joseph about an extreme solution, the removal of Gambino and Lucchese to reset the balance. Joseph denied planning such a move. Many contemporaries, however, believed he encouraged it while keeping his distance. Magliocco then sought help from a younger leader, Joseph Colombo, to carry out the plan. Colombo weighed the request, judged the risk, and instead informed Gambino and Lucchese. The revelation lit a fuse. The commission convened, heard the story, and forced Magliocco to step down and pay a large fine for plotting against fellow bosses. Colombo, rewarded for his disclosure, rose to head the former Profaci family, now renamed. Fingers pointed at Joseph as the true author of the idea, though proof tight enough for court never emerged. In that world, accusations of disloyalty could be as dangerous as convictions. As pressure mounted, federal prosecutors also turned up heat. Joseph faced subpoenas for grand juries and a high-profile inquiry in 1964. That October, on the way to see his lawyer, he vanished. His family told reporters he had been forced into a car on a Manhattan street. He later said he had been held for weeks and released. Skeptics suggested he staged his absence to duck testimony and to avoid immediate punishment from rivals angered by the Magliocco affair. The truth remains disputed. What is clear is that his disappearance created a vacuum. The commission, no longer willing to accept his leadership in New York, recognized Gaspar di Gregorio as head of the Bonanno organization. Il refused to accept that replacement. Loyalists split, and men who had once toasted each other at weddings now eyed each other across clubrooms with distrust. All the habits that had kept Joseph's world smooth for 3 decades cracked a little in that season. Long friendships soured, crews picked sides, and cash routes that had run for years without trouble began to stall. Police watched as tension rose. Newspapers finally got the drama they had wanted for years and wrote breathless copy about a family tearing itself apart. Joseph stayed in Arizona more often, sent messages rather than appearing in person, and tried to guide his son through storms that experience said could not be calmed quickly. He still believed in order. He still liked negotiated settlements and scheduled payments, but the middle ground he favored was narrowing. Old allies were gone or ill. New figures liked speed over caution, and the next phase of his life would be defined not by calm growth, but by a grinding contest for control that would last years and leave scars that even the desert sun could not fade. By the early 1960s, a new voice cracked the wall of silence that men like Joseph had spent decades building. Under bright lights and television cameras, a tired soldier named Joe Valachi sat before senators and said out loud what officials had long suspected but could not prove in court. He described a structure with families, a council to settle disputes, rules enforced by fear and favors, and leaders who preferred whispers to signatures. He used words the public had rarely heard on the evening news. Names were read into the record. The 5-clan map of New York appeared in living rooms across the country. That moment shifted pressure. Police had a fresh mandate and a broader audience. Reporters learned new terms. Every quiet lunch that Joseph once liked could now be framed in a headline as something more than a meal. Those hearings tightened the circle around him at the same time that a separate chain of events pulled him into a storm. His long friendship with the Profaci side had been useful for years, strengthened by his son's marriage. But when Joe Profaci died, the balance wobbled. Joseph Magliocco took charge there, and trust did not quite match the old days. Across town, Carlo Gambino's influence reached farther each season. Tommy Lucchese stayed steady. In that tense landscape, an idea surfaced in a private room, an idea to remove 2 powerful men and tilt the map back toward the older alliance. The story that emerged later, from confessions and committee files, suggested Joseph knew of the plan and gave it quiet encouragement while keeping his distance. He denied it. He always denied involvement in plots that big. But what matters for the timeline is this. Magliocco asked a younger captain named Joseph Colombo to handle the action. Colombo chose survival over blind duty and told Gambino. The effect was immediate. The council met, judged Magliocco harshly, fined him, and removed him from leadership. Colombo was lifted to lead in Profaci's place, a reward for speaking up. Questions fell on Joseph's head like hard rain. There was no indictment linking him to that plot, but the room no longer trusted him. Pressure from rivals, prosecutors, and cameras peaked in the fall of 1964. A bodyguard eased him into a car for a ride to see his lawyer. He did not arrive. His family called the police and said he had been taken. Days turned into weeks. Newspapers repeated the mystery, and rumors flowed through clubrooms and kitchens. Some believed enemies had forced him off the map to punish him for the Magliocco business. Others believed he staged his own absence to skip a grand jury appearance and give himself shelter while tempers cooled. He later said he had been held, and then released. Investigators never produced a full account that settled the matter. What can be said is that his disappearance created a vacuum that drew allies into argument, and argument into open conflict. With the chair empty, the National Council chose a replacement to keep business stable in the Bonanno group. They reached for an elder with old country roots and a reputation for caution, Gaspar di Gregorio. He came from the same Sicilian town and spoke with the same rhythms as Joseph, which for many years had been a source of harmony between them. But appointments from above rarely sit well with people who think they should inherit by blood or build by sweat. Joseph's son, Bill, believed the family name and years of service entitled him to step in. Several captains agreed. Others liked the council's choice. Lines appeared down the center of a structure that had always presented a unified front. The split was not about ideology. It was about control, pride, and how the next decade would look. What followed became a saga that reporters later called the Banana War, a phrase that made a serious conflict sound like a comedy bit, but in truth described a long, draining fight for leadership. Both sides tried to collect dues, control crews, and claim the right to make decisions on union deals, shop routes, and clubhouses. Old friends crossed streets to avoid each other. Phone calls ended without agreements. Meetings set up to make peace turned into standoffs watched by patrol cars. Through all of it, the men who had spent their lives avoiding the front page now found their names in type, not because of dramatic trials, but because the city loves a feud, and this one took place in neighborhoods where reporters already knew the addresses. At one point, a meeting arranged on a quiet Brooklyn block at a house near Troutman Street was meant to settle the argument. One side thought they were going to talk. The other arrived wary and armed. Shots were fired, windows broke, sirens approached, and men scattered down alleys and between parked cars. There is no need to paint the scene in detail. It was not a movie. It was confusion and fear on a winter street, and it confirmed for both camps that the split had turned into something that could not be patched in an afternoon. The police had their own word for it: confirmation. Conflicts that admit no compromise always end up confirming suspicions in the files of people who read reports for a living. During much of this time, Joseph stayed in Arizona. Whether by choice or necessity, he kept his distance from the tightest knots of the fight. He managed through notes, couriers, and brief calls from payphones. He urged calm. That had always been his way. He told Bill to host talks, to accept narrow wins rather than chase grand victories. A father's hope met a son's pride. Bill had grown up in a world where his last name opened doors. He understood his father's code and admired it, but did not always practice its patience. Younger men around him did not carry memories of the old port city in Sicily, did not know the faces on the walls of a cannoli bakery in 1931, did not believe compromise would protect them from rivals who felt emboldened. That generational difference made peace harder. Galante, the underboss whose control in the 1950s had made outer boroughs nervous, could not help Bill because federal narcotics charges had taken him off the street earlier in the decade. He would spend years in custody. His absence deprived Joseph's circle of its most forceful presence, leaving administrators and negotiators to carry weight that muscle had often lifted. On the other side, Di Gregorio had age and council backing but struggled to collect money in a family where his legitimacy was debated at every table. As months turned to years, raids picked up. Small cases landed in front of judges: illegal gambling, loans with illegal terms, bribery linked to a permit, a union man charged with fraud. Most sentences were light. The real punishment came from the instability itself. When drivers refuse to cross a picket line because they don't know who is in charge, trash piles up, deliveries miss deadlines, and managers reach for other suppliers. Income melts away in the sun of uncertainty. In 1966, Joseph returned to public view. He arrived without drama, wearing a suit that made him look like any older businessman visiting New York for a meeting or a doctor's appointment. Reporters followed him on sidewalks and asked questions about his time away. He said what he had said before. He had been taken and then released. Prosecutors had not forgotten him during his absence. He faced subpoenas and contempt motions for refusing to answer certain questions in past inquiries. He preferred silence and constitutional rights to conversation under oath, a choice that cost him fines and short jail stints for contempt but protected him from perjury charges. In the same season, the council signaled a hard boundary. He could live, but he could not reassert control in New York. The order was retirement in all but name. He did not like being told what to do. He also understood arithmetic. He was outvoted. With Joseph visible again but barred from taking back the chair, the internal struggle lurched forward. Di Gregorio's health faltered, then improved, then faltered again. A younger captain named Paul Siaka began to gather support among those who wanted to end chaos through a fresh start. He promised calmer streets and reliable pickups, the exact pitch that had once been Joseph's strength. Bill pushed back, refusing to accept any leader not chosen by his father. Street corners bore the cost. There were attempts on cars, warnings delivered with smashed glass, arguments in back rooms that ended with doors slamming. Police presence grew. Agents who had worked the waterfront in the 1950s now sat in unmarked sedans, eating cold sandwiches while watching two social clubs on the same block, observing who walked where and with whom. The money side of the life sagged. Illegal card rooms drew fewer players because police rings got faster, and because television kept more people at home after dinner. Numbers games still worked in barber chairs and candy stores, but state lotteries had started to nibble at that revenue in neighboring places, a trend that would expand later. Union ties still mattered, on the docks, in produce markets, in the garment district, but lawmakers demanded audits and new elections. Every audit meant questions about invoices, trucks, parking permits, and overtime sheets. Every new election meant candidates promising to shake off outside influence. Influence rarely disappears when someone says so, yet the cost of keeping it went up. To offset that cost, leaders needed order. Instead, they got two captains arguing over who had the right to collect from the same route. The structure that Joseph had designed to reduce conflict now produced it. Friends fell away. Some switched sides to keep their shops open. Others moved out of state. A few cooperated with prosecutors, giving general information that confirmed patterns without enough detail to close the whole story. Joseph watched this erosion with a mix of anger and resignation. He had built a life that depended on calm routines. He had told crews for years that avoiding spectacle was the foundation of survival. Now spectacle had arrived and would not leave. He could not fix it from a porch in Tucson, not with letters and careful phone calls. The sight pained him, not because of hurt pride alone, but because he knew the old rule. Public wars invite public crackdowns, and public crackdowns can erase decades of careful work in a single bad week. By late 1968, the dispute had run its course. De Gregorio was no longer a viable leader. The council elevated Siaka to settle matters and told Bill to step aside. Joseph suffered a heart attack that December, a shock that forced him to face the reality of age. He had outlasted many of his contemporaries by avoiding drama. Now drama had taken years off him in a handful of seasons. He announced a retreat to Arizona and said publicly that he was leaving the old business behind. Whether he intended to cut every tie or simply realized that continued involvement would bring more heat than harmony, the effect was the same. New York would move on without him, and the name he had guarded would become just one among many in a changing city. What did those years reveal about the crimes connected to his world? They showed in smaller pieces the same pattern that had existed since the 1930s. Illegal gambling arranged behind ordinary storefronts, loans that grew impossible to repay, payments collected from shop owners in exchange for peace, pressure applied to union officers so that contracts landed on certain desks first, and corruption in the granting of licenses and access. There were also allegations supported by files, informant notes, and foreign investigations that people under his umbrella played roles in international narcotics routes passing through Canada, with Montreal as a key point, especially in the 1950s and early 1960s. He rejected those accusations in speeches to friendly audiences and later in his memoir. Investigators remained unconvinced. What the war added to that picture was less a new category of wrongdoing than a rise in collateral harm, more fear in neighborhoods that once ran on predictable if illegal routines, and a greater willingness among some participants to take rash steps to protect their slice. In Arizona, he poured attention into lawful investments that had once been side projects, land deals, property management, interests in small firms that built real wealth in the Southwest's boom years. These became his public face. He had always liked tangible assets. Concrete pads under a dry sky hold value without asking questions. He saw doctors, walked at dawn, drank coffee on patios, and tried to convince himself that the past had been swallowed by the desert horizon. The FBI did not share his sense of closure. They considered his retirement partial at best, and kept watch. Grand juries called him again to ask about national meetings and the internal fights of the mid-1960s. He leaned on silence and the protections the law offered, a strategy that earned him contempt citations and short stretches in custody. Prosecutors also filed obstruction counts in connection with those refusals and with efforts they said were designed to influence testimony. He contested where he could and negotiated where he had to. The public record from those cases shows fines, probation terms, and periods behind bars measured in months, not years. Meanwhile, the group that still carried his name in newspapers entered a new chapter. Siaka tried to rebuild a calm business model, then others followed. Natale Avola for a short period, Philip Rastelli afterward, each with his own style, each dealing with the long shadow of the war and with a city government that had grown more skilled at watching. The narcotics crackdown intensified nationally. International routes shifted, and foreign partners changed. In Montreal, men who once sat in cafes discussing shipments now faced their own battles as law enforcement in Canada took a stronger hand. In New York, newer crews learned that overt conflict was too expensive. They mimicked Joseph's earlier preference for low-intensity control, but the times were different. Wiretaps improved. Surveillance became more patient. Juries grew more willing to convict after months of careful tapes were played in court. Joseph, adjusting to life as a semi-retired elder, kept family at the center. Dinners grew quieter. A small circle visited him in Tucson, talking about grandchildren, real estate, and the weather. He could be charming in those moments, engaging, a gracious host. He could also turn stubborn when talk drifted to old business. He believed to his last days that order had been his gift to a rough world, and that the storm of the 1960s had been an avoidable tragedy fueled by impatience and vanity. He accepted that he had been the symbol around which the conflict rallied, but he would not accept that his choices had made it inevitable. That is how many leaders recall their lives, choosing to see the parts that confirm their sense of themselves as rational guardians, rather than gamblers who sometimes lost control of the table. Looking back at the arc from Valachi's televised testimony through the end of the Bonanno War, the outline is clear. A secret structure came into focus for the public. A risky plan to redraw the board backfired and stripped Joseph of standing among his peers. A disappearance, whether forced or staged, shattered the stability he prized. A bitter fight for the chair lasted years and drained the enterprise. He returned to view but found the door to leadership closed. Heart trouble and age sealed that closure. Through it all, the familiar ledger of crimes, gambling, usury, extortion, labor corruption, bribery, and allegations of narcotics involvement by men in his orbit continued at reduced margins and higher risk. The harm to neighborhoods was steady, if often quiet. Money diverted from honest work, fear woven into daily routines, pressure on small businesses that simply wanted to keep lights on and families fed. The road ahead for him would mix courtrooms and calm mornings, old grudges and new laws. He would write about his life, casting his choices as those of a man who valued tradition and structure in an era of change. Prosecutors would continue to press him for details he would not give. Others would rise and fall in the city he once organized, some with his name still attached to their headlines, even when he had nothing to do with their actions. The next chapter brings the 1970s, a period of legal cases, public attempts to shape his legacy, and a growing distance between the man and the myth that had grown around his surname. The year after the heart scare, he tried to live like any retiree, with a tidy ledger and a quiet porch. Sunrise in Tucson painted the Catalina Mountains pink, and he breathed easier in that dry air. He told visitors he was finished with the brawls of New York, done with late meetings and whispered feuds. He kept to a routine: coffee at dawn, a walk before the heat, an hour with mail, then a drive to check on property. He liked to watch construction crews lay rebar, to ask the foreman about permits and schedules, to talk about materials as if cement alone had ever held a city together. He had come to the desert to last, and lasting meant routine. It also meant lawyers, because New York and Washington were not done with him. For a stretch in the early 1970s, the government pushed a civil case to strip his citizenship, arguing that he had entered the country irregularly, decades earlier, and had hidden facts on forms. He hired counsel, pushed back in court, and used the same patience that had once kept rival captains in line. Hearings led to rulings to appeals. The process took years. In the end, he remained an American citizen, a result that pleased him because it meant permanence. Land in Arizona, a passport, a place to grow old without packing a suitcase under pressure. He knew that victory did not end scrutiny. Agents would still knock, subpoenas would still arrive, but the ground felt steadier under his shoes. Back in New York, the enterprise that had carried his name tried to rebuild after the war that had split it. Paul Siaka tried first, then Natalia Avola, and after Avola's death, Philip Restelli. Each promised to cool tempers, to get deliveries moving on time, to fix revenue that had thinned during the feud. They tightened grip on illegal gambling and loans, continued to influence union elections where possible, and looked for new angles where old ones had gone stale. The city had changed again. State lotteries began to cut into neighborhood number games. Bars filled with televisions kept customers in their seats at home instead of in back rooms where cards once turned. Labor law reforms added oversight to dock work and garment shops. More records, more audits, more signatures. To keep up, leaders leaned harder on legitimate covers that could hide cash, and on intermediaries who looked like ordinary salesmen, plumbers, or food distributors. The business model never disappeared. It adapted. Across the decade, one older name reappeared in headlines: Carmine Galante. He had been Joseph's forceful deputy in the 1950s until a long federal sentence removed him from the street. Released in the mid-1970s, he started to act like a man who intended to sit on the chair again whether anyone gave permission or not. He used old loyalty and new alliances, especially among Sicilian newcomers, to pull power toward himself. Reporters wrote that he pushed hard on narcotics profits, a claim that matched the era's major cases. Joseph watched from Tucson as Galante's drive shook old arrangements. He did not speak publicly about it. He had always insisted in private and later in print that he rejected narcotics. Prosecutors and foreign police continued to tie men linked to his family to that trade, especially through Montreal and down into New York via wholesalers who treated pizzerias and groceries as fronts. Whatever his personal stance, the network he built had connections that others used for that purpose. In 1979, Galante was shot dead in a Brooklyn restaurant. New York papers splashed images across front pages. Joseph did not comment. He had known the man as a lieutenant and had promoted him years before. Now younger men would settle who led next. While all that churned in the city, a different kind of threat arrived with the patience of a bookkeeper. In 1976, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone adopted a false identity, took the name Donnie Brasco, and slid into the outer circle of the Bonanno cruise. He spent years at small tables, sharing coffee, running errands, building trust with men like Benjamin Ruggiero and Dominic Napolitano. The method was simple and relentless. Show up, remember birthdays, pick up tabs, carry messages, never rush, never brag. He was after daily details, not a headline. That sort of work had been rare when Joseph ran the company from close range in the 1930s and 1940s. Surveillance then meant detectives on foot, a camera across a street. By the late 1970s, infiltration meant months of tapes, coded notes, and a presence inside rooms that once felt safe. When the operation finally ended in 1981, arrests followed. The damage went beyond court papers. Trust thinned. Crews questioned how a stranger had stood beside them so long without anyone seeing through the act. The Bonanno name took a hit that would echo for a decade, and for a time the family lost its seat on the National Council, a public demotion that would have been unthinkable in Joseph's prime. Joseph's own legal troubles did not end with retirement. Prosecutors kept calling him before grand juries about national meetings, about the mid-1960s plot that reshaped leadership across two families, about fights and alliances that touched jurisdictions far from Brooklyn. He continued to refuse to answer certain questions, citing his rights. Judges cited him for contempt. Separate cases accused him of obstructing justice by pressing others to keep quiet. Outcomes varied, sometimes fines, sometimes probation, sometimes months in federal custody. He served short terms in prison in his 70s and 80s, time measured in months, not years. He carried himself there as he did outside, reserved, courteous, never a complainer in public. Reporters asked if a man his age belonged behind bars for refusing to talk. He said little. The habit of silence, learned young, did not fade with age. He did a very different kind of talking in 1983 when he published a memoir. He called it A Man of Honor. The book told his story from the Sicilian port town to his seat at the table in New York and into Arizona. He framed his life as that of a traditionalist who valued order, respect, and rules. He described meetings in careful tones, avoided the forensic details that prosecutors prefer, and insisted that the structure he helped build was a form of governance among people who, in his view, would otherwise have lived under chaos. The book sold well. Readers who had grown up hearing whispered names got a guided tour from a man who had been at the top. Critics said the account polished his image and reduced the costs borne by victims. Law enforcement read it closely and used it to shape questions in new subpoenas. He still declined to answer in court what he chose to describe in his own pages. That contradiction angered investigators, pleased fans, and shaped his late-life public profile as a retired executive telling his version of events. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought other huge cases in the wider world he had once navigated. The Pizza Connection investigation traced a transatlantic heroin pipeline through Sicily, Canada, and American cities, with proceeds laundered through small restaurants that sold slices by day and moved cash at night. Trials in the mid-1980s convicted numerous defendants, including figures with ties to the Bonanno sphere, though not Joseph himself, who by then was a step removed from daily operations. The commission case brought down leaders of other New York families and put the National Council on display in a way that even Valachi had not achieved. In that period, the Bonanno organization remained outside that particular courtroom lineup, a sign of the damage the Brasco operation had caused to its standing among peers. None of this returned Joseph to leadership. It did, however, validate his long-held belief that spectacle invites crackdowns. The underworld he had tried to keep quiet now ran under bright lights. On the personal side, life in Tucson deepened. He hosted family dinners where pasta bowls and salad plates shared table space with silence about the past. He walked in Sabino Canyon when his legs allowed, stood in shade when noon baked the sidewalks, and enjoyed small graces. a grandchild's laughter, a well-cooked meal, a phone that did not ring during the night. He buried old friends. He visited doctors and followed instructions more than he once would have. Age softened him in some ways, made him more talkative about recipes and less about strategy. Yet when conversations tilted toward New York, he straightened in his chair. He remained precise about dates and names, corrected errors in a neutral tone, and steered talk back to the principle that order had been his aim from the start. He did not apologize for a life that had harmed others, at least not in public. He viewed his role as administrative, as if harm belonged to the sharp end of the enterprise rather than to the hand that pointed. He still faced the legal grind. In the mid-1980s, after the memoir and the television appearances it triggered, another grand jury in Arizona asked for his voice under oath. He declined. A judge found him in contempt and sent him to serve time. He returned home thinner, quieter, but not broken. He had come through worse seasons. He worked in his yard, read newspapers, and watched as a new generation took charge in the city. Under Rastelli, and then other leaders, the Bonanno group tried to regain its place with a blend of old methods and new caution. Joseph observed from a distance. He had become history in real time, alive while reporters wrote about him in past tense. He did not mind that status. It kept most strangers polite and most neighbors curious but careful. When people today ask what crimes tied most clearly to his name, the list repeats from earlier decades, because his role was always strategic. Illegal gambling that moved money from back rooms to collectors, high-interest loans enforced by pressure, protection payments from shops and distributors, union corruption that turned elections and contract votes, bribery to ease permits, and obstruction of justice when called to account. These were the strands of the web he spun and managed. Allegations of narcotics trafficking persist in records connected to his associates, particularly through Canadian links and Sicilian partners from the 1950s into the 1970s. He denied approving that line. Investigators insisted the roots used by men in his orbit could not have grown without tacit blessing. The truth, as with most closed worlds, sits behind doors that only a few ever opened fully. What can be said in a public story is that the business model he perfected, layers, buffers, and legitimate fronts, made such traffic easier to hide, whoever was in charge of a particular shipment. In those years he worked on his legacy with purpose. The memoir was one piece. Quiet conversations with journalists off the record were another. He cooperated with a dramatized retelling that aired years later, when television producers loved to mix real names with actors and sweeping music. He liked the dignity it gave to his image. He disliked the moments that turned careful men into caricatures. He knew a camera can't capture a silence in a doorway, or a nod at the end of a meeting, the subtle signs that had once meant the world to him. He preferred the written word, where he could control pace and tone. He kept notes, corrected drafts, and took satisfaction in sentences that sounded like him, calm, measured, orderly. All the while, the harm that his system had done never vanished. Owners who had paid for peace in the 1940s remembered envelopes handed over with a tight smile. Sons who had watched fathers lose shops to loans remembered the day a man in a suit visited and left with half the future. Workers who had walked onto picket lines at someone else's signal remembered how a week's salary could disappear in a strategy that had nothing to do with their families. Joseph knew these stories existed. He had lived long enough to see the costs from angles he had ignored when young. He would say, if pressed, that street life before his order had been worse, and that his rules reduced violence. That may have been true at times. It does not erase the fact that he profited from illegal pressure that warped markets and choices for decades. By the end of the 1980s, he was well into his 80s, a rare age for a man who had sat where he once sat. He had outlived rivals, prosecutors, journalists who had chased him down sidewalks after Appalachian, and even some of the agents who filed reports with his name underlined. He carried the weight of survival with a certain grace. He attended baptisms and graduations, shook hands at 4th of July picnics, and posed for photos where he looked like a neighborhood grandfather in a pressed shirt. People who had no idea about old newspaper stories waved from porches. Arizona had a way of washing the past in evening light. He let it. At the same time, he never quite loosened the grip on that idea that had guided him from the start. Order above all. He admired tidy neighborhoods, on-time appointments, and quiet partnerships that left cash boxes full and tempers low. The world outside moved faster. Credit cards, computers, Wall Street stories on the nightly news, but he preferred balance sheets you could run with a pencil. When someone mentioned wiretaps or microfilm, he listened as an outsider to a language invented after his peak. He adjusted in small ways, kept names out of notebooks, took walks instead of long calls, and trusted that, even in retirement, discretion could still matter. What remained for him in the next stage were the years when age strips a man of pretense. He would face more court dates, refine his public account further, and watch the family he founded stumble, rally, and then change again under leaders with their own ideas. In Tucson, he would learn how to be an old man in America, which is its own test of patience and pride. He had built a life on the belief that planning beats improvisation. The 1990s would give him time to plan nothing more than tomorrow's walk and the list of groceries he and his wife needed from a store where no one cared what the newspapers once printed in bold letters. When you're ready, we can sit with him in those later years, look at the last court fights, the last public words he spoke about his code, and the long twilight of a figure who shaped a century and then learned to sit quietly while it moved past him. He woke before dawn in the 1990s the same way he had when he ran crews in Brooklyn, but now the first light fell on desert gravel, not cobblestones. He poured coffee, stepped outside, and listened to birds cut across a pale sky. He liked the quiet because it asked nothing from him. The city that had once moved to his rhythm now drifted through newspapers on his patio table. An elderly man in the Catalina foothills reading about a world he had shaped and left. That was his morning. He was proud of his age, proud of outlasting so many storms, wary of the attention that came with it. The phone rang less. The knock on the door when it came was more likely to be a neighbor than an agent. Still, now and then, a letter would arrive with a court seal on the envelope, and he would feel the old weight, questions from officials, schedules for hearings, a reminder that history does not end when a man declares it finished. The law had new tools. The RICO statute, passed 2 decades earlier, gave prosecutors a way to tie leaders to enterprise crimes without catching them at a specific handoff. Wiretaps grew sharper. Long investigations built cases patiently. In New York, the commission case in the mid-1980s had put the governing board itself on trial. The defendants were not from his house, a side effect of the infiltration disaster that had knocked the Bonanno group out of national councils for a time. Other bosses went away, some for long terms. He watched legal language replace gossip, watched transcripts of meetings become evidence, and thought about the old advice he had given: keep rooms small, keep voices low, and let money look boring. He felt vindicated by the arrests that followed grandstanding, but he also knew that the new era made even quiet men vulnerable. His own legal path in those years was a narrow, repeating road. Subpoenas arrived. He declined to answer targeted questions. Judges found him in contempt. Fines were ordered. Short sentences followed. He did time in his 70s and 80s, months here and there, a routine that would have crushed a younger man's reputation but, for him, looked like the last tax on a long career. Separate counts accused him of obstructing inquiries by urging silence from those close to him. Outcomes varied. Acquittals on some points, convictions on others, probation terms in some instances. The pattern never changed. He refused to become a witness against his own past. When he walked out of a facility after one of those short bids, Tucson's sun hit his face. He nodded to no one in particular, and went home to a kitchen where the clock still ticked at the pace he preferred. Meanwhile, the group that started with his name on the door tried to stand up straight again. After the damage from the undercover case in the late 1970s and early 1980s, leaders worked to rebuild credibility inside their own network and among peers. Philip Rastelli guided from inside and outside custody as his health permitted. After Rastelli's death in 1991, a crew boss named Joseph Massino consolidated authority. Massino's rise mattered because he shared parts of Joseph's temperament. He valued caution, disliked flashy gestures, and wanted steady earnings without loose talk. In time, the Bonanno people regained a place at the national table. From a chair in Arizona, the elderly founder saw echoes of his own early rules playing out in a city he no longer visited. He did not write public notes of approval. He did not need to. The result, the return to a calmer posture, was the point he had argued for his entire life. The wider city had moved on. The garment district shrank. The docks were not the docks he knew. Containerized shipping changed the map of influence. New industries rose in outer boroughs that had never factored into the old revenue routes. State lotteries and new forms of legal betting cut deeply into the numbers racket. Credit cards and ATMs changed the way small businesses handled cash, making traditional collections more visible. Unions faced reforms and oversight that limited old levers, yet the basic illegal trades remained familiar. Games run in the back of social clubs, high-interest lending wrapped in friendly visits, influence on hiring and routes, relationships with vendors and construction sites. The Bonanno banner adapted, as it always had. finding niche lines where attention ran low. The founder noticed the continuity in the change and decided both confirmed his thesis. The shape evolves, the logic stays. He had time to study his own life. A memoir published in 1983 had turned him into a storyteller of his own legend. He chose the tone, measured, dignified, heavy on tradition, and left out operational detail. The book closed doors for prosecutors who wanted him to break habits on the witness stand. It opened doors for filmmakers who wanted an arc they could shoot in soft light. Before the decade ended, a television miniseries dramatized his story. The show arranged true events and invented scenes to fit a narrative arc, turned private rooms into stage sets, and gave the public a version of the old life that moved like a novel. He watched it with the same tilted head he used when reading a contract. Interested, critical, unhurried. He appreciated what it got right, the need for order, the weight of obligations. He shrugged at liberties taken because he knew television prefers tall peaks and deep valleys, while his own style had been a steady line. Visitors to his house in Tucson saw two sides of him. In the kitchen, he lifted lids, checked the sauce, asked for plates, and poured wine with the easy grace of a host. At the table, he liked talk about children, schools, weather patterns, and real estate. If someone brought up the old days, he did not become angry. He simply moved the conversation into generalities. Times were different then. People valued their word. Men kept schedules. He refused to turn the past into a lecture series. In the living room, he sat with a straight back even in his 80s, listened more than he spoke, and corrected a detail calmly if someone repeated a rumor as fact. It was a habit from decades when accuracy mattered because a wrong date or the wrong name could cost money or bring heat. He kept footprints light. He drove himself less often, preferred a relative at the wheel, and on medical advice walked shorter routes. Doctor's visits became part of his week. He handled them like business appointments. Arrive on time, listen, ask direct questions, thank the staff, leave quietly. A pacemaker kept his heart steady. He took prescriptions the way he had once assigned tasks, consistently, without drama. The toughest adjustment was not physical. It was the loss of control over the pace of life. He had spent 50 years setting the tempo in rooms where his voice carried weight. Age takes that instrument away, and the man who had relied on timing and patience now had to learn a different form of patience made of waiting rooms and reminders. His son Bill visited often. Lines of worry had deepened on Bill's face during the years of the internal war. Father and son shared pride, caution, and a sense of the family name as something more than a label. They also diverged, especially on how to handle public attention. Bill spoke and wrote openly in the 1990s, co-authoring books, consulting on productions, offering comment on a world he insisted had rules that outsiders misunderstood. The father viewed that instinct with a mix of fondness and disapproval. He had written his own account already and preferred to stop there. He told Bill, gently but firmly, to let the story stand. Bill smiled and said that times had changed, that the country now wanted first-person accounts instead of whispered myths. It was a conversation they returned to over years, each man respecting the other's reasons, neither persuading the other to change course. Reporters still came by sometimes. They were younger than the ones who had chased him after the Appalachian scandal. They carried digital recorders and asked questions shaped by the Valachi hearings, the commission case, and the Brasco operation. He treated them with courtesy, offered nothing they could use in court, and spoke about values rather than specifics. He was careful to avoid language that glamorized crime or dwelled on the mechanics of illegal work. He said when pressed that he ran a system to reduce chaos in rough neighborhoods, that he favored conversation over force, and that he believed communities prefer predictable outcomes even when the choices are narrow. Critics called that a rationalization that ignored victims. He did not argue. He had learned to let critics speak. Time would judge everyone's claims. He also carried the burden of being the last widely known member of the old guard to reach such an advanced age. Obituaries for his contemporaries had long been written. Younger reporters looked at him and saw a living archive. Older officials looked at him and saw a symbol of resistance to their most cherished arguments. He was both, and also a man who liked a certain brand of coffee, a particular chair on a small patio, and a sunset that set the mesas on fire for 5 minutes every evening. The grand sweep of history sat next to the ordinary routines of an American retiree. That contrast was one reason people remained fascinated. It is difficult to imagine a life that holds both meetings in hidden rooms and quiet mornings watering plants. While he aged in the desert, his old organization in New York kept walking through changes. It regained standing with Messino's careful leadership, then absorbed fresh law enforcement pressure as the years closed. Straw companies appeared and vanished. Construction sites had their own dramas, as did restaurant supply routes and union locals connected to trucking and waste. Arrests came in waves, plea deals stacked up, and a few trials pushed names into the news again. Through it all, the group tried to avoid the public brawls that had damaged it so badly in the 1960s. That, at least, matched Joseph's taste. He had always said a quiet week was a profitable week. The numbers attached to those profits were not what they had been in the heyday, but stability mattered more than flashy returns. He did not live to see the full circle of that story. In 2002, at 97, he died at home in Tucson. The cause, reported simply, was the end that arrives for almost everyone who reaches such an age. Family gathered. Notices appeared in papers that had printed his name for 70 years, sometimes with respect, sometimes with disdain, always with interest. Obituaries called him the last of a certain kind of leader, the final link to the old Sicilian ties that had shaped the first generation of organized crime in New York. Some praised his discipline, others emphasized the harm done by extortion, rigged contracts, corrupted unions, and the long tail of illegal economies that twist choices for honest workers and owners. Both pictures belonged in the record because both spoke to the effects of the system he had built. In the weeks after his death, the city he once managed did not stop. Trials continued. Meetings were held in restaurants and boardrooms, lawful and otherwise. The news cycle moved on to other figures, other scandals. His family held its own rituals, shared its own memories, and returned to daily life. His son outlived him by several years, writing and speaking about the name that had defined his life. The organization carried that name forward, in an era of cameras on every corner, phones that recorded without anyone noticing, and laws designed to make leadership itself the crime. What Joseph left behind was less a set of rules than an attitude. Stay measured, avoid spectacle, keep buffers, don't confuse bravery with recklessness. What, finally, can be said about his involvement in crime without tipping into instruction or sensationalism? The list is the same one that followed his career from the 1930s, illegal gambling seated behind ordinary storefronts, lending at rates that trapped borrowers, protection schemes that turned fear into revenue, influence with labor that bent elections and contract votes, bribes that moved permits or inspections, and running through the years investigations that tied members of his circle to narcotics traffic despite his public stance against it. He did not rob stores or stage dramatic street incidents. He operated as an executive, setting goals, assigning tasks, and enforcing discipline. He used legitimate businesses to blend illicit proceeds with lawful cash. When called to account, he refused to describe who did what and when, accepting contempt sanctions and obstruction findings rather than break a code he thought defined him. It is also fair to say that the picture he painted of himself, a guardian of order in a rough sphere, was incomplete. Order came at a price paid by shopkeepers who handed over envelopes to keep windows intact, by drivers who had to take unprofitable routes because someone said so, by workers forced into strikes that served private arrangements, by gamblers whose losses fed a machine that never explained its appetite. He understood those costs in abstract terms. The faces were far away from the rooms where he made decisions. Late in life, when asked if he regretted
anything, he avoided the word. He preferred to talk about survival, about a code that, to him, kept a certain kind of violence rare. That may have been true at times. It did not make the pressure less real for people on the other end of the conversation. He held small rituals even in his last months. A suit lay pressed in his closet because he believed a man should always be ready to honor an occasion. Shoes were shined on Sundays. Birthday cards were signed neatly. He kept lists for groceries and for calls he needed to return. He did not carry a computer. He trusted paper. He wrote gratitude notes to doctors and to neighbors who brought food. He never learned to like air conditioning and preferred open windows until June forced him to admit the desert winds every summer. He told a grandson that most problems could be softened by listening long enough and speaking only after the other person had run out of words. It was the old method, translated into family advice. From a distance, his story can look like a rise, a rain, a fall, and a long coda in the sun. Up close, it is also the story of immigration, of neighborhoods that supported each other and sometimes exploited each other, of city government learning across decades how to meet secret structures with open laws, of families stitching together brand-new American lives while holding on to old patterns. He lived almost a century. He saw ships replaced by planes, speakeasies replaced by nightclubs, ledgers replaced by spreadsheets, informants replaced by wiretaps and undercover agents. He absorbed those changes without changing his core habits. He believed that patience beats noise, and that paying on time kept more doors open than arguing ever did. The last thing worth saying in this part is simple. He was complicated. He could be kind at home and cold in business. He could present as a calm neighbor, and also stand as a quiet force behind practices that hurt people. He wanted to be remembered as a man who kept his word, who valued tradition, who built orderly systems. The record, assembled by courts, journalists, and those who lived under his arrangements, shows the profits and the costs. Both belong in any honest telling. In the remaining parts, we can look at how his name traveled after his death, how stories about him were told and retold, how the group he founded tried to adapt to a world he would hardly recognize, and how the lessons good and bad of his style echo in other corners where people prefer whispers to headlines. He left a long shadow that did not vanish when the porch lights in Tucson went dark. The name he had carried through almost a century lingered in court records, in family albums, in headlines written by reporters who had retired and then been replaced by others who learned his story from clippings in a drawer. Memory did not sort itself neatly. Old neighbors remembered a polite man who greeted them on his walk. Detectives remembered a file that never stopped gathering paper. Business owners remembered visits that came with smiles and expectations. In that tangle, a portrait sharpened of a leader who made calm look like virtue and efficiency, feel like mercy, while running an enterprise based on illegal leverage. He had believed discipline could make a dangerous world bearable. The truth, shown by a long ledger, was more mixed. Routine concealed pressure, and predictable schedules, masked choices narrowed by fear. He had crafted the balance in stages. In the 1930s, he used the ban on alcohol to build networks, then shifted when the law changed, keeping gambling, loans, and union influence at the center. In the 1940s, while the nation focused on war, he turned quiet trades into dependable income and grew legitimate businesses as cover. In the 1950s, he presented himself as a gentleman investor who happened to know which doors to knock on, even as men under his banner handled collections, set house rules at card rooms, and approached shopkeepers about insurance. In the 1960s, his taste for order collided with rival ambitions and with the cameras that followed a scandal in a small upstate town, then with a disappearance that still draws arguments at dinner tables. In the 1970s and 1980s, he lived mostly as a retiree while the government pressed him in courtrooms, and he responded with the silence that had defined his career. By the 1990s, he was a symbol, an old man who had outlasted friends and foes, still precise in speech, still resistant to confession, still sure that schedules and rules were the only way he knew to think about the world. People often want a clear list of crimes, a simple inventory they can check off. His record does not work that way because he rarely touched the sharp end of any scheme. He designed a system that delivered revenue from illegal gambling tucked behind ordinary storefronts, from usurious lending disguised as favors, from protection arrangements that turned risk into a bill to be paid, from influence over union decisions that changed which trucks moved first, which contract drafts got signatures, and which job sites stayed quiet, from bribes that made inspections easier or nudged licenses along, and, through associates and partners, from international narcotics trafficking that investigators documented across years, even as he publicly rejected that trade. When the government asked questions, he declined to answer and accepted contempt and obstruction consequences. He was convicted and punished for those refusals, serving short terms and paying fines in his later decades. He understood the legal line and stayed just inside it when he could, stepping over only when silence itself broke the rule. Long before he died, he had become a case study for both sides of a long struggle. Law enforcement saw in him the argument for new tools, enterprise laws that focused on patterns, not single acts, wiretaps that captured quiet meetings, undercover work that cracked rooms that once felt locked from the inside. His generation had thrived when evidence meant a policeman's memory and a blurry photo. The later world ran on tapes and transcripts, yet he remained difficult to pin down because he designed distance between himself and any single act of enforcement. He met at kitchens, not boardrooms, used couriers instead of memos, and asked trusted aides to take care of specifics. The result, over decades, was a thick paper trail that showed his presence around events without a neat diagram linking him to a particular bag, a particular handoff, a particular envelope on a particular day. Look closely at how he built that distance, and you see habits learned early and refined over time. He favored elders as buffers, men with calm tempers and good memories. He placed legitimate businesses at stress points in his world. Bakeries that supplied cafes where card games ran after hours. Import firms that handled cheese and olive oil, while also providing offices where associates could meet without raising eyebrows. Garment cutters that dealt with unions and trucking routes he knew well. A funeral connection that created a reason to visit certain neighborhoods without attracting notice. Each company had real product and real staff. That reality made the cover harder to peel back. He did not invent this method, but he was one of its most disciplined users. His influence stretched beyond New York through ties that began in his birthplace. Castellammare del Golfo sent its sons to cities across North America. In Montreal, a community linked by language and custom-created channels for trade both legal and illegal. Names familiar to him appeared in Canadian files. Families related by blood and town history cooperated across borders. And investigators later described routes that carried narcotics from overseas producers to North American streets using those networks. He resisted public association with that line. He told sympathizers and, later, readers of his memoir that he banned narcotics. Authorities remained skeptical, pointing to convictions of men in his orbit and to long trials in the 1980s that laid out the mechanics of transatlantic trade and money laundering through small restaurants. The tension between his denial and the cases on paper became a permanent feature of his story. He liked to portray his code as a civic virtue. He talked about order as if he had been a neighborhood planner. Many people who lived under his arrangements did experience fewer scenes that make headlines. Fewer loud confrontations meant fewer risky raids, which meant fewer sudden job losses for families tied to businesses the enterprise taxed. That stability had a cost that deserves equal weight. Money drained from shops that might have hired extra staff or bought better equipment. Contracts steered not to the lowest bidder or the most reliable firm, but to the one with the closest handshake. Union elections tilted so that workers' needs served private arrangements first. These are not abstract points. They touched paychecks, schedules, and opportunities for people who never met him, but lived with the results of decisions made in rooms where they had no voice. We can talk about personal choices and still remember the wider frame. Immigration shaped him. He arrived young, learned English, and watched a city that promised freedom insist on harsh limits for newcomers. He entered at a time when political machines ran on patronage and when whole neighborhoods depended on internal networks to find work, solve disputes, and create safety. Many used those networks for good. Some used them to build power that ignored the law. He placed himself near the center of that second stream and learned to draw legitimacy from cultural habits that predated the country he adopted. When he said honor, he meant loyalty to his circle and endurance under pressure. When the law used the same word, it meant fairness for people outside his circle who still deserved a fair choice. The conflict between those two meanings ran through his life. He faced the legal system repeatedly in the 1970s and 1980s. Cases to strip his citizenship. Argued that he had misled authorities decades earlier. He fought back with counsel and patience, and ended those fights with his passport intact. Grand juries called him to speak about meetings and plots that changed the leadership map of a city. He invoked his rights, accepted the penalties that came with silence, and walked out when the time came, older and thinner but unbent. He returned to his kitchen, measured coffee, and told visitors with a small smile that he had nothing new to say. To some, that silence looked like dignity. To others, it looked like a refusal to account for harm. He did not try to reconcile those views. He preferred to let the contrast stand. He also took control of his narrative in print. He worked with a writer to produce a book in the early 1980s that presented his view of a long career. He used the tone of a patient grandfather explaining a neighborhood's old customs. He made clear that he saw himself as a traditionalist who used rules to reduce chaos. He described meetings without giving play-you-play detail and told readers that a leader's job was to keep pride from burning down the room. The book influenced how the public talked about him. It also angered some in law enforcement who felt he had found a way to speak broadly while still refusing answers that judges demanded. The contradiction between public storytelling and private silence only made him more famous. Media attention followed. A dramatization of his life turned decades into a season of television and cast actors to speak words he had approved or inspired. The production took liberties, as all such projects do, but it returned him to the screen as an elder statesman rather than as a fugitive, which was how many had first seen his name in a headline. He accepted the polish because it aligned with his view of himself. He rejected the idea that the camera could capture the real work of his world, which had always happened in the space between words. He told friends the show got the feeling right, even if the scenes were tidy in a way meetings rarely are in life. His late years brought small routines that sometimes revealed the person behind the headline. He liked 2 newspapers, read them both, and compared stories out loud. He corrected details with a finger on a paragraph but rarely raised his voice. He called grandchildren over to the fridge to show them a magnet from Sicily and another from a diner in Arizona, and said both places taught him the value of waking early. He bought fruit at a market where the clerk knew him as a pleasant older man who tipped well. He sent birthday cards with careful script. None of this redeems the pressure his system placed on others. It rounds him into a person, which matters because the harm done by organized crime is often easier to grasp when we see that ordinary faces can hide structures that bend a community's choices. After he died in 2002, the organization that had carried his name through decades faced a new century with different rules. That story belongs mostly to others, but it reflects the legacy of his methods. Leaders who followed tried to bring back quiet by avoiding public drama. They learned that silence was harder to maintain in an era of phones in every pocket and cameras at every corner. Old trades remained, trimmed to narrower margins. Construction had its own angles. Restaurant supply chains had their own hierarchies. Waste and recycling routes offered opportunities where oversight ran thin. Each line demanded patience and skill. Each carried risk that a stranger in a corner might be working with the government. The Bonanno banner regained standing for a time and then suffered fresh shocks. Through those changes, people told stories about the founder, as if invoking him could restore an older order that, in truth, had depended on circumstances that no longer existed. Family kept his memory as families do, not through case citations but through meals and stories. His son, who had stood beside him in the worst days of the internal war, wrote his own accounts, gave interviews, and tried to explain a code that he believed outsiders misunderstood. He died years after his father, carrying into his own final decade the same tension between pride in an ordered system and acknowledgement of its impact. Other relatives chose private lives and avoided cameras. In Arizona, neighbors kept photos of a polite man who waved. In New York, older shopkeepers remembered a time when problems were solved privately at a cost they could calculate. Younger workers grew up in a city that taught them to call a number on a poster on the wall when someone asked for an envelope in exchange for peace. A fair telling also asks what law enforcement learned from chasing him across years. They learned to look for patterns rather than for single incidents. They learned to follow money through small companies that did real work and also provided cover. They learned the value and the limits of undercover work, taught painfully by the long case that placed an agent inside rooms where his successors had once felt safe. They learned to talk to workers, not just to leaders, because pressure often reveals itself in overtime sheets and truck logs before it shows up in a meeting. They learned that televised hearings can teach the public a vocabulary that makes juries more open to pattern cases. Those tools did not erase organized crime. They shifted the balance toward transparency and accountability in places that had long run on silence. His legacy and culture endures because his life sits at the intersection of immigration, ambition, law, and story. He crossed an ocean as a teenager, built a system of influence in a new country, confronted the growth of federal power and media exposure, and then narrated his own version late in life. He stood for the first generation of New York bosses in a way that few others did because he lived long enough to tell his side, and because he maintained a public face that did not terrify casual observers. That calm was calculated. Calm reduces scrutiny. Calm invites people to treat harmful arrangements as manageable inconveniences, rather than as distortions of a community's choices. That effect is one reason critics insist that narratives about order can be as dangerous as narratives about glamour. It is tempting to end here with a final judgment, but the more honest ending acknowledges that the record is both solid and incomplete. We know from testimony, files, and his own book that he managed illegal gambling, usury, extortion through protection schemes, labor corruption, and bribery, and that he was penalized for resisting grand juries and for obstructing inquiries. We know from long cases and international cooperation that men under his banner, especially in the 1950s through the 1970s, moved narcotics through channels linked to his network, even as he denied authorizing that line. We know he built layers of legitimate businesses to cover and blend revenue, and that he used buffers to reduce direct exposure. We know he maintained ties to other cities, and to Canada, that expanded reach. We know he argued in print that he preferred conversation to force, and that he saw himself as a guardian of order. And we know the people on the other end of his system paid in cash, in choices, in lost opportunities. There is one more aspect to consider: how his careful style influenced those who came after. Many leaders studied his restraint and tried to copy pieces of it. They learned to avoid nightclubs that made the tabloids. They met at breakfast, not at midnight. They wore brown shoes instead of polished black, when they wanted to look like salesmen rather than executives. They kept crews small and spread out responsibility. Those habits made it harder for investigators to pin acts to names. But the world also changed in ways that made his template less powerful. Digital records replaced cash ledgers in small businesses. Cameras turned every storefront into a stage with an audience. Banking rules tightened. Wiretaps grew cheaper and clearer. Undercover work remained rare and risky, but when it succeeded, it produced months of tapes that no amount of calm could explain away. The space where his style worked shrank year by year. In the end, he remains a paradox that makes sense only when you accept the contradictions rather than trying to erase them. He was both a neighbor who carried groceries for a friend and a leader who organized pressure that bent a market. He was both a retiree who loved the Arizona light and a symbol in court papers that argued for stronger tools to confront organized crime. He was both a writer who shaped his image and a witness who refused to speak under oath. He was both a planner who reduced random noise and a cause of long-term harm wrapped in quiet routines. That complexity is not an excuse. It is the shape of the truth. The city he once shaped now holds his story in museums, archives, and the memories of people who lived through the changes he helped push. Students read about the Castellamares War and the creation of the 5 families. They learn why a council existed and how it mediated disputes. They watch video from the Appalachian Scandal and see how a day in upstate New York changed national attention. They study the Valakai hearings to understand how testimony can shift public understanding. They read about the Bonanno War and see how internal conflict can drain a structure. They examine the Pizza Connection and the Commission case to understand how transnational collaboration and enterprise laws work. In each chapter, his name appears, sometimes at the center, sometimes at the edge, always part of a pattern that runs through the century. If you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythm he liked. Early mornings, careful schedules, meetings that end before dinner, money that moves quietly, a ledger that balances. That rhythm is comforting because it suggests control. Control is what he craved, and control is what the law seeks for a different reason. To ensure that people who never agreed to a private order can still make choices without facing a knock on the door that comes with a price. The tension between those two kinds of order, one private and paid, the other public and shared, runs through the story of Joseph Bonanno. It is why his life still draws attention. It is why the harms he helped organize still matter to people who were not yet born when he stepped off a ship almost a century ago. There are no secret revelations left in this account, and there is no attempt to polish rough edges. The point has been to tell the truth, as it is known in public sources, and to do so without turning crime into entertainment. The hook that drew us in An Old Man in the Desert turning pages of his own book was real. The harms behind the calm words were real too. If there is a lesson that can travel beyond one life, it may be this. Systems built on quiet pressure can look stable for a long time, but they still borrow against the future, and the bill arrives eventually, sometimes as a subpoena, sometimes as a raid, sometimes as a son staring at a door that will not open because the house he thought he inherited has been locked by people who learned different lessons than the ones his father taught. You can, if you like, set the book down here and breathe in the same desert air he once loved. Think about how a single person can shape a network, and how that network shapes people who never asked to be part of it. Think about the difference between order and justice. Think about the power of a soft voice in a loud city. The rest of this story belongs to how his name traveled after he was gone, how others used it, how the family changed in a century that moved faster than any planner could manage, and how the record, taken whole, asks us to remember the costs carried quietly by people whose names never appeared in any headline. 2 years after he was gone, the thing he had always said would ruin everything finally happened. The leader who had restored his old organization's footing in the 1990s looked across a courtroom at the weight of a modern case, measured the odds, and chose cooperation. That decision sent a shock through a world built on private promises and quiet nods. For decades, Joseph had insisted that silence was the hinge on which the entire door swung. Break the hinge, and the door falls. In 2004, with the founder already a memory in Tucson, the hinge broke in a very public way. People who had never met him, who knew his name only from books and movies, suddenly understood how fragile a private order can be when incentives change. To see how that moment grew, it helps to remember what the organization had become by the early 1980s. After the undercover operation that lived under the alias Donnie Brasco ended in 1981, the family staggered. Trust, once the glue in every room, turned brittle. The National Council distanced itself. Inside the House, a separate crisis gathered speed. A faction that disliked the reigning plan tried to seize control. The internal showdown culminated in acts of violence in 1981 that removed 3 senior figures who had challenged leadership. The case would simmer for years, crossing borders and showing up in court papers on both sides of the US-Canada line. A young Sicilian expatriate based in Montreal, later well known in his own right, pleaded guilty in a US court decades later to a role in that 1981 episode as part of a racketeering count. These events are part of the historical record, not retold here for shock value, but to explain how leadership consolidated after a near split. That consolidation opened the path for a careful, low-profile figure to take the top seat in the early 1990s and rebuild. He favored steady income over spectacle, revived the group's standing among peers, and quietly reclaimed a chair at national meetings. He studied the founder's early playbook and applied the parts that still worked. Small rooms, quiet schedules, no public swagger. Under his watch, the house regained the stability it had lost after the undercover case, even as legal risks kept rising with every new wiretap and enterprise indictment. For a time, it looked like the old belief order beats chaos could still carry the day. Across the border, the Montreal connection kept pulling threads through the story. Families with roots in the same Sicilian town maintained friendships and business ties. The 1970s and 1980s had seen routes that moved contraband through Canada to New York and other cities. Prosecutors in the United States and Canada charged people linked to those routes, describing in court how money crossed counters in restaurants and cash houses. In the 2000s, the Canadian side faced its own upheavals. The man who had pleaded guilty in the United States in 2007 returned to Montreal later and died a few years after that. His father and son had met violence during a turbulent period that remade that city's underworld. These events, while distant from Joseph's Arizona mornings, trace back to the cross-border ties that began in the 1930s when men from Castellammare del Golfo built lives in 2 countries and used that bridge for lawful and unlawful trade. Back in New York, the 1990s leader built his reputation on caution. He visited social clubs rarely, preferred private homes, and encouraged captains to act like small businesses. Keep expenses down, collect on time, avoid disputes that force meetings with people who hold badges. He maintained influence over predictable earners, gambling in small rooms, loans to shop owners, arrangements with vendors and contractors, and leverage in certain union locals, and he did it without demanding headlines. Shopkeepers who had paid envelopes for decades still did so, hoping that predictable fees would shield them from broken schedules and other disruptions. The public saw very little because the model worked best when it looked boring. That was the founder's old lesson, carried into a new era. Then the ground shifted. In 2003, prosecutors filed a sweeping case that reached back to the 1981 internal showdown and forward to newer acts. It pulled in the 1990s leader, his close advisors, and men who had handled critical errands for years. The government now had more than informants and photographs. It had long-form surveillance, cooperating witnesses at high ranks, and enterprise charges designed to treat a pattern of conduct as the crime. One of the leader's closest relatives by marriage, a longtime underboss who had helped run the Dewan Dute, agreed to cooperate and provided details that cut through layers of buffers. Under the pressure of possible life without freedom and the risk of the most severe penalties, the top man chose a path that shocked almost everyone. He sat with agents, answered questions, and later testified in open court. It was the first time a sitting boss of that level had taken that step in the modern era. That decision changed how people talked about Joseph's legacy. For 60 years, he had insisted on silence. Even when silence put him in a cell for contempt, he had told his circle that quiet protected the many from the mistakes of the few. Watching from beyond the timeline, if such a thing were possible, he would have recognized why the 2004 flip mattered. It did not just help win a case. It signaled that the older code had thinned. Financial incentives, family considerations, and new legal tools had made a private order less binding. Younger men looked at the costs and the rewards and concluded that cooperation sometimes served self-interest better than fidelity to a fading rule. That calculation belonged to a different century than the one that formed Joseph's mind. The cooperation did not end with interviews. The former boss wore a hidden recorder in custody and captured a conversation with his designated successor, a street-sharp leader whose taste for attention exceeded the older man's. That tape became evidence. Years later, the former boss took the stand and spoke under oath about meetings, votes, and decisions. A courtroom that had once heard the founder refuse to answer questions now heard his successor explain, in precise language, the inner workings of the house. The testimony helped secure convictions, including one against the successor, who had tried to keep control with a bolder style. The effect across the network was immediate. Morale sagged, suspicion rose, and the Bonanno name, already dented by the undercover debacle of the early 1980s, took another public hit. It is important to remember that while those high-profile moments draw headlines, the day-to-day continued to look like it always had for people on the other end of the arrangement. Small businesses still faced pressure couched in polite terms. A buyer was urged to place orders with a specific distributor. A contractor was told which sub to use. A trucker found a route reassigned after refusing a request. Illegal loans filled gaps that banks would not touch, and repayments were enforced with reminders that never needed to get loud. Those patterns had caused harm since the 1930s. In the 2000s, they still caused harm. What changed was how easily investigators could track them. Digital trails replaced handwritten ledgers. Phones recorded dates and locations without anyone pressing a button. Cash moved through accounts that auditors could examine with warrants. Pressure that once hid behind ordinary routines began to show up on spreadsheets. The founder's reliance on old-world habits would have struggled in this landscape. People often ask whether Joseph truly refused to allow narcotics. His answer, in print, was an emphatic yes. He wrote that he had banned that trade in his house, that he viewed it as corrosive and too risky. Law enforcement answered with case files showing that associates, lieutenants, and distant partners participated in international routes that ran through Montreal and other points. The truth likely sits where both claims meet. He preferred to keep distance from any line that invited maximum heat. Men around him, especially independent earners with foreign ties, saw money on the table and took it. Buffers made it easier for the top seat to claim ignorance, both to himself and to outsiders. In later decades, trials in the United States and Italy described networks that matched the structure he built. Legitimate fronts, masking illegal shipments, cooperative ties between Sicilian and North American circles, and money washed through ordinary businesses. Those trials tied his house to that world even if his personal stance had been no. Part of the appeal of his story is how it compresses big forces into personal rhythm. Immigration explains the beginning. The ban on alcohol explains the first windfall. Depression-era need explains why illegal loans found customers. Post-war growth explains why union influence could steer fortunes across docks, markets, and factories. Television, and later wiretaps, explain why rooms once safe became risky. Enterprise statutes explain why leaders who never touched a cash bag still face trials. Cooperation explains why the code cracked. At each stage, Joseph's habits calm, control, buffers, worked until the environment changed. He adapted often, but no one can outrun a century. After his death, popular culture kept polishing the legend. Movies and series recycled familiar scenes, a quiet table in a dim room, a code word that unlocks a new level of trust, a betrayal that turns softly spoken rules into courtroom transcripts. Projects about the undercover agent who called himself Donnie Brasco stayed popular, and each retelling reminded viewers that the founder's house had once missed a stranger at its own table. New documentaries folded his memoir into a broader history of organized crime's rise and retrenchment in the United States. He had liked the dignity of being portrayed as an orderly man. He would not have enjoyed the parts that pushed past that mask to tell the story of the people who paid the price for that order. Those people deserve room in any honest part of this story. A tailor in Queens paid every Friday so that no one parked a truck across his doorway on Saturday. A produce seller in Brooklyn bought ice and space from a wholesaler he did not choose. A bar owner ran a small card game to keep slow nights afloat and found herself on a schedule with collectors she did not invite. A stevedore took a week off because the union calendar said so and understood that the calendar served more than one master. For decades, across boroughs and years, the names of those who did the paying rarely appeared in papers. Their stories, gathered in court affidavits and in oral histories, show the gray costs of a system that talks about order while moving money from the many to the few. Even in death, the founder's name acted like a magnet. Writers used it as shorthand for a style. Older, more formal, less flamboyant. Some praised the restraint compared to later figures who enjoyed tabloid light. That praise missed the point. Restraint is not the same as virtue when the business model turns fear into revenue. Other commentators used his name as a lesson in endurance. How to run a tight enterprise across decades. That too requires context. He endured partly because he avoided spectacle, and partly because the tools that caught later leaders did not exist in his prime. He was skilled. He was also lucky with timing. There is a practical lesson here about law and policy. When the public understands how a secret structure works, pressure builds for tools that fit the shape of the problem. The Valakai hearings in the 1960s gave language to reporters and juries. The Appalachian fiasco gave pictures to people who needed to see to believe. The undercover Brasco case gave tapes that turned speculation into sound. The commission case and similar prosecutions gave a legal framework, RICO, that allowed patterns to stand in for a single dramatic act. In each wave, Joseph's methods looked less magical and more like what they were, careful routines designed to hide the costs of control. As those routines became legible to outsiders, the law got better at drawing straight lines between a quiet leader and the harm his structure caused. The cooperation in 2004 by the man who had revived the house in the 1990s was a turning point of a different kind. It showed that the code at the top could break not just at the edges but at the center. When a boss testifies about votes on a national council, about the naming of successors, about internal discipline, it affects how every other room in the network thinks about risk. The founder would have read that change as a cultural shift he could not stop. In his mind, loyalty was not just a rule, it was a way to make sense of life. For younger men who had grown up after televised hearings and enterprise indictments, loyalty competed with other values: protection of immediate family, calculation about the odds, and a modern sense that institutions are not sacred. What did all of this mean for the Bonanno organization as it moved through the 2000s and 2010s? It meant smaller targets, shorter projects, and a constant worry about microphones. Construction still offered angles, but oversight doubled. Restaurant distribution still offered routes, but suppliers kept records that could be subpoenaed. Waste hauling still offered territories, but cities renegotiated contracts with eyes open. Retail gambling moved online in legal forms that eroded demand for backroom play. Illegal loans remained a last resort in neighborhoods where banks said no. But collections drew faster attention. The house adjusted by narrowing its footprint and avoiding public quarrels. It sought stability, the founders' original goal, but found the margins slimmer and the blows from law enforcement harder. Families evolve when the founding figure dies. Some want to preserve the exact tone of earlier years. Others want to shed the past and start new. The Bonanno name carried both impulses. Bill, the son who had once battled for control in the 1960s, had already built a second life as a writer and a public speaker by the time his father died. He presented their code as a set of ethics, a discipline that, in his view, outsiders judged without understanding its context. Critics pushed back, pointing to the dressed-up forms of coercion that code rationalized. The debate never closed because it was not about a single act. It was about how communities manage power, especially when official power is distant or distrusted. If you step back from names and titles, the founder's life reads like a study in organizational behavior. He identified reliable revenue, built layers to separate leadership from risk, diversified into legitimate ventures that masked illegal streams, enforced discipline through a mix of incentives and consequences, and valued alliances that reduced friction. Those principles show up in legal enterprises too. The difference here was the core activity, extracting value through fear and influence, rather than through free agreement. It is useful to say that plainly because part of the myth around him paints a picture of a victimless order, a tidy system that kept only the worst chaos at bay. That picture leaves out the very real pressure placed on people who would have chosen differently if they had been free to choose. His stance on violence, the claim that he reserved it for last, sounds reasonable, until you remember that the threat underwrites the whole plan. The polite conversation about insurance feels polite because the ground is already tilted. He understood that showing less force could earn more money in the long run. That choice made him more durable and made the system seem less stark to outsiders. It did not remove the lever that moved the money. He was not a reformer of a broken city. He was a builder of a private order that charged for the illusion of protection. What survives of him today are echoes in how people in his old world talk about risk. Leaders tell younger men to avoid the camera, to treat every phone as a message to a future jury, to keep meetings short, to pay attention to the simple signs: who sits where, who arrives on time, who speaks too fast. Those are the same cues he taught. They persist because they reflect human behavior, not just criminal technique. They also persist because some parts of his method still reduce exposure. But the larger table has changed. Public institutions are more transparent than they were. Neighborhoods have more channels to report pressure. Juries understand patterns better than they did. The space for private orders has shrunk. What survives in the public imagination is different. Some remember him as the last of an older type, a leader who looked like a banker and sounded like a teacher. Some remember him as a symbol of corruption that hid behind comfort. Both views carry truth. He was dignified in bearing and cold in business. He was precise about schedules and indifferent to the personal cost those schedules imposed on others. He loved family dinners and built systems that exploited other families' work. He refused to gossip with reporters, and then wrote a memoir that steered the conversation toward his preferred conclusions. Complexity is not a defense. It is a reminder to avoid simple stories that make a hard subject easy. Toward the end of this long telling, one scene returns. An older man on an Arizona porch, reading about a city he left, a city he never stopped thinking about. The file with his name on it sat in cabinets far away, growing thinner only when he was no longer there to add pages. The organization he founded adjusted, stumbled, adapted, and kept going in smaller ways. The law that chased him learned, adapted, and kept going too. The people who had once handed over envelopes taught their children different tactics. Call a hotline, keep records, insist on receipts, join a trade group that defends its members. Each of those choices nudged the city away from the private order he had built. There will be one more part to tell, a final look that gathers the threads and places them where they belong. In a century-long conversation about how power moves, who pays, and how memory turns decisions into legacy. Before that, take one last walk with him in your mind's eye. He checks the time, straightens his cuffs, and leaves a house where the counters are clean and the coffee is set for morning. He believed that tidiness in small things could manage big things. In some rooms, for some years he was right. The rest of the city needed a different kind of order, open, shared, and fair. And it took decades of work from lawmakers, reporters, judges, and ordinary citizens to make that order feel real. His story sits between those two visions, as a caution about the comfort of routines that hide costs, and as a reminder that even the calmest voice can move a lot of money when fear pays the bill. The last chapter begins with a name that still carried weight in rooms where people preferred whispers. You could hear it on street corners as an example for how to run things without drawing light, and you could see it in court files as a reminder that quiet does not erase harm. After 2002, the year he left the world at 97, his presence sat like a framed photograph in a family living room, always there, often glanced at, sometimes taken down and dusted, when a new problem made old lessons feel relevant. His portrait meant discipline, control, and a habit of blending legal and illegal work so tightly that outsiders struggled to pull them apart. It also meant a history of pressure on people who had little choice but to accept terms they did not set. The two truths lived side by side and could not be separated. In New York, the organization that had used his name as a banner tried to find its balance in a century that did not honor many of the habits he had relied on. The careful figure who rebuilt the house in the 1990s had walked a line the founder would have recognized: collect steadily, avoid scenes, favor back rooms over bright lounges, and let others chase headlines. The group regained respect among peers and a measured place in national councils. The quiet did not last. In 2003, a broad case swept through old history and recent events, and prosecutors set out to prove that the culture of buffers and soft voices still hid acts that broke the law. One of the leader's closest aides cooperated. The leader himself agreed to provide information and later appeared as a witness. That act, a sitting boss choosing to talk, shook a value system that had survived for generations. The hinge holding the door of silence creaked and then gave way. If you grew up on the founder's code, the sound felt like a house settling in an earthquake. The cooperation led to convictions. A successor who had acted as the public face for a time, a man with an appetite for attention that the founder would have disapproved of, faced trials that ended with long sentences. Others followed him into custody on racketeering counts that treated the structure, not just any single act, as the offense. The impact went beyond names in an indictment. It bled into daily practice. When the person at the top shows that the old ceiling will not hold, everyone below starts to look for exits. Suspicion becomes a daily companion. Meetings grow shorter. Projects shrink. Work that once felt familiar begins to feel like a trap, and the old rhythm of calm collections and punctual envelopes stutters. The shape of crime around them changed too. Gambling that once ran in back rooms through cards and numbers tickets now competed with legal options that lived on screens. Some of the demand moved into authorized channels. Loans that used to carry illegal terms faced a new world of payday lenders and internet products that charged high prices in plain sight. Unions, long a lever for influence, dealt with oversight that watched elections and audited contracts. Construction still offered angles where bids and schedules could be nudged with pressure. But developers kept lawyers close and sent emails that created trails. Waste and recycling remained an arena where roots had value, yet city contracts adopted clauses that gave inspectors room to check for undue influence. The underworld adjusted with the same basic goal: keep earnings stable without shouting. The difference was that phones, cameras, and software made even a whisper echo. In Canada, the offshoot city that had once been a way station for travel and trade endured its own storms that illustrated how deeply the founders' connections had sunk roots. Montreal in the 2000s moved through a turbulent period that rewrote its hierarchy. A figure who as a young man had left for New York in 1981 in the midst of the Bonanno family's internal crisis, later pleaded guilty in a U.S. court to a role in that episode as part of a racketeering case decades after the fact, then returned to Canada and died years later. His father, and later, his son also met violent ends in separate incidents in that city's conflicts. None of these details change the founder's personal record in Arizona, but they show how the bridge built in the 1930s between Sicily, New York, and Montreal carried both legitimate trade and long lines of association that law enforcement on two continents would spend years mapping. When people asked after 2002 what exactly Joseph's crimes had been, The answer looked familiar to anyone who had read the dockets across his long life. He had managed illegal gambling through clubs and back rooms, turned private debt into a revenue stream through high-interest lending, collected payments from shopkeepers in exchange for peace, influenced labor decisions that shaped contracts and work schedules, and used bribery to smooth inspections and licenses. Through associates and allied circles, investigators tied his network to narcotics traffic that moved across borders, especially in the 1950s through the 1970s, despite his stated ban on that line. When asked to speak under oath about meetings, votes, and plans, he refused and accepted contempt citations and obstruction convictions that brought fines, probation, and months in federal custody in his later years. That list remained the list. What changed after his death was the way the city talked about those acts not as exotic scandals but as long-term costs that neighborhoods had carried quietly for decades. He also left behind a published self-portrait that shaped how later generations thought about him. A man of honor painted him as a traditionalist who used rules to prevent flare-ups that could burn a neighborhood. He wrote in measured prose that sounded like a seasoned executive reviewing a career. He avoided operational detail, elevated the virtues he prized: punctuality, discretion, patience, and downplayed the harm that routine collections imposed on people who lived under his system. The book made him a reference point for anyone studying the 2080s, first American generation of Sicilian-born bosses. It frustrated prosecutors who saw it as a public speech given by a man who would not answer direct questions under oath. It warmed readers who appreciated its tone. It has to be read alongside the record in court files and investigative reports to get a full picture. Popular culture kept coming back. The dramatization of his life rested on a certain tension. Viewers could admire a calm leader, while still learning that his calm directed acts that hurt others. Documentaries about the undercover agent who called himself Donnie Brasco revived the embarrassment that the founder's house had suffered when a stranger drank its coffee and collected its confidences. New projects about the Pizza Connection case reminded audiences that the transatlantic routes described in court matched the shape of the networks he built. Each retelling added polish or stripped it away, depending on the angle. He once said television could not capture silence in a doorway, and he was right. It could, however, capture the scale of harm that a quiet leader can orchestrate. What did law enforcement do with his memory? They used it as a training tool. New agents studied the Castellammarise War to learn origins. They watched footage from Appalachian to see how a single day could shift opinion. They read Valakai's testimony to understand how a cooperating insider can give language to a structure. They analyzed the commission case to see how enterprise laws turn patterns into proof. They examined the Brasco tapes to remember the power of patience. They read about the 2004 cooperation to see how incentives can break through old codes. The founder's life became a syllabus not because he invented everything, but because he embodied an approach that lasted long enough for others to measure it and respond. What did his old world do with his memory? It kept using his name as a standard when arguing about style. When a new leader grew loud, someone would mutter that the founder would have disapproved. When a plan threatened to draw fire, someone would say that the old way was to slow down. But nostalgia does not stop subpoenas, and style does not cancel the fact that the essential business model depended on fear. The repeated promise of peace meant less trouble only because the capacity for trouble sat ready. He had understood this contradiction and found a way to live with it. Others tried to do the same, and the cost kept landing on the same kinds of people. Small owners, workers, and neighborhoods caught between private demands and public order. It is natural to ask whether anything in his code deserves rescue. He believed in punctuality, in keeping your word, in showing up prepared, in treating staff with courtesy. Those are good habits everywhere. He believed in buffers that protected leadership and in rules enforced outside the law. Those are not. His discipline reduced spectacle and protected revenue streams. It also reduced transparency and shielded arrangements that took choice away from people who were not invited to the meetings where their days were scheduled for them. The same calm that made him a pleasant neighbor made him effective at running a system that turned everyday transactions into tolls. Near the end of his life, he liked to hold court by not holding court. He sat at the table, poured wine, and let others talk. When someone was wrong on a detail, he corrected it gently. When someone pushed him to judge a new leader's tactic, he smiled and changed the subject. He had lived through enough cycles to know that today's clever plan becomes tomorrow's lesson in a grand jury room. He preferred to keep the conversation at the level of general principles. Don't chase attention. Keep books straight. Avoid angry men. Those lines sound like common sense because they are, and yet in his world they served a purpose beyond good manners. They kept pressure steady and disguised. The last full measure of his influence appears in how the Bonanno group tried to function after the shocks of the 2000s. Reporters and officials described leadership transitions: the 1990s boss who cooperated, the acting boss who succeeded him and went to trial, the figures who were said to hold power from cells or through intermediaries, the lieutenants who tried to keep collections on schedule despite surveillance and arrests. Convictions at different points tied names to acts racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and other enterprise crimes, while acquittals or dismissed counts at other points showed the limits of cases too. Through all of it, the organization still aimed for what the founder had pursued: stable earnings without noise. The margins were thinner, the risks higher, the patience shorter, but the model persisted in shrunken form because demand for shortcuts and for protection from uncertainty never truly disappears. It is worth giving a moment to the people who opposed him and those who tried to clean up after him. Journalists who spent years on the beat learned to separate rumor from record. Prosecutors built cases patiently, knowing that talking too soon could break the chain they were assembling. Union reformers put their names on ballots and lived with the stress that comes when old arrangements are challenged in public. Business owners decided one by one to say no when someone asked for an envelope, to call a number posted on a city website, to testify when they would rather stay quiet. Those acts, spread across decades, did not erase the past. They changed the odds for the next generation, which is what public order is supposed to do. His story also fits into a larger American frame. A nation that prides itself on open markets and equal treatment under the law wrestled with private systems that charged hidden fees to participate. Those systems often grew in places where official structures failed or were slow to respond. Immigrant neighborhoods built their own safety nets, and, sometimes, their own private rules. A young man from a Sicilian port learned to turn those rules into profit. He lived long enough to see the country find better ways to serve the neighborhoods he had once used, and long enough to see some of those neighborhoods outgrow the bargains he had offered. Change took time. It always does. A final inventory helps to keep this telling honest. He entered the United States in the 1920s and joined the underground economy that Prohibition had created, moving liquor during the ban and then shifting focus when the law changed. He rose during a violent leadership struggle and became head of a New York family at 26. He organized gambling routes, loan collections, protection payments, union leverage, and corruption that eased permits and steered contracts. Investigators tied members of his network to narcotics trafficking with international partners, especially through Canada, though he publicly denied allowing that trade. He used legitimate businesses as cover and as investments. He cultivated ties with other cities and with Canada that expanded reach and influence. He sat on national councils that mediated disputes. He avoided cameras when possible, avoided public displays, and taught his people that dull days are good days. He faced subpoenas and refused to answer, preferring contempt and obstruction findings to testimony, and served short terms in custody in his later decades. He retired to Arizona, wrote a memoir that shaped his public image, and died in 2002 at 97. The enterprise he built survived him, changed, and met new pressures with mixed success. The harms his system caused: financial pressure on businesses, distorted labor decisions, fear that stands behind polite language, stayed with the people who had paid. If there is a soft note to end on, it belongs to the ordinary life he built alongside the extraordinary one. He liked a clean suit, a simple meal, and a schedule that began before sunrise. He loved the desert light and the way Tucson evenings cooled a hot day. He enjoyed being a grandfather, listened closely when children told stories, and repeated small advice about being on time and watching carefully. Those scenes do not absolve what his structure did. They complete the picture. People who run harmful systems often look ordinary. That is why systems, not personalities, must be the focus when cities decide how to protect choice and fairness. You can close the door on this story with one last look at a man who believed in order above all. He learned to trust few, to speak less, to act through buffers, and to prize calm as both method and mask. He built a long career on routines that turned fear into fees. He faced the law, argued with it by staying silent, and outlasted many of the people who chased him. He told his version in print and left out the parts that did not fit. He lived to see a world that made his methods less effective and watched successors wrestle with new tools that did not exist when he was young. He left behind a legacy that scholars, reporters, and families still argue about. He is both a caution and a case study. Proof that discipline can scale harm quietly, and proof that patient, public work can narrow the space where harm hides. If you walk away with anything, let it be the clarity that culture and crime can wear the same suit and speak the same polite words. The test is whether choice is real on the other side of the table. In the rind, rooms he managed, choice was often an illusion backed by a threat no one had to say out loud. The city his story belongs to has spent a century trying to replace private, paid order with public, shared order. It is not a straight line, but it bends. People learn, laws adjust, habits change. The founder would not recognize some parts of that progress. He would recognize the steady rhythm of the mornings that mattered to him. Coffee, lists, clean counters, and a plan. Those mornings carried him a long way. The city moved past him anyway. We have walked from a Sicilian bay to Brooklyn tenements, through clubs and council rooms, into Arizona kitchens, and beyond his last day to the echoes that followed. We have kept the focus on what can be said without glamour and without turning details into instruction. We have named the crimes linked to his leadership: gambling, loans at illegal terms, protection arrangements, labor corruption, bribery, obstruction, and noted the record that ties his circle to narcotics routes he said he forbade. We have kept in view the people who paid and the systems that pushed back. There is no grand finale here, only a long view. A life of order that cost other people their choices, and a country's effort to widen those choices again. Step by patient step,